When the plane lifted off the World War I French airfield, the pilot was both angry and confident. He'd seen a junior pilot fail to take down a German aircraft. Furious, he jumped in the cockpit of the nearest plane, determined to do the job himself. He would not miss. He never had. Raoul Lufbery was a bold fighter, a celebrated flying ace. He had the enemy warplane in his sights and closed in. But as he steadied his weapon and readied to fire, the enemy gunner shot first, piercing Lufbery's fuel tank.
Lufbery was in a tough situation. Planes on fire, we're talking wooden fabric aircraft with gasoline, burning quickly, fanned by wind. So he tried to get out of the airplane, and some witnesses say that he's on the wing trying to slip the aircraft out of the path of the flames and put the flames out.
Lufbery spiraled out of control and into the clouds. In a war that claimed millions of lives, most who served in the military fought because they had no choice. But Raoul Lufbery was different. He didn't have to be there. He was an American. Lufbery and a small group of other American adventurers volunteered for World War I long before their country joined. They were known as the Lafayette Escadrille.
These young men, in some respects, were idealists, primarily from very fine backgrounds, well-educated.
They were lawyers, authors, heirs to banking and railroad fortunes, Ivy League graduates, friends of royalty, sons of privilege. All they wanted was a chance to fly.
The Lafayette Escadrille will probably be remembered as the men who couldn't wait, men who could have avoided the war but insisted on getting involved.
The young pilots came to the war with romantic ideas of adventure and heroism. They had no idea what they were in for. In 1915, as the First World War turned into a brutal stalemate, France and Britain hoped for United States help in defending their lines against German attack. But the U.S. refused. Far away from the pounding storm in Europe, America proclaimed neutrality early in the war, and President Woodrow Wilson warned sharply against taking sides in, quote, these times that try men's souls. But in Paris, a team of young Americans was busily plotting to enter the war despite what their country said. They were led by Norman Prince, a Harvard graduate on his way to a legal career, who was spending time at his parents' French summer estate, and William Thaw, who dropped out of Yale to pursue aviation. Prince and Thaw shared a taste for adventure and a love of France. In the spring of 1915, they approached the French government with an unprecedented idea, an all-American volunteer air squadron, or escadrille.
The French would love to have these young men, but there's a minor problem. If you establish a unit of Americans flying as Americans in combat, you know the Germans are going to raise a ruckus about this because America is supposed to be neutral.
Despite the risks, France allowed the aspiring pilots to fly under the French flag, a technicality that preserved American neutrality. But the French also hoped that by allowing individual Americans into the war, it might persuade the U.S. government to enter as well. In April of 1916, Prince, Thaw, and the other young adventurers became official, calling themselves the Lafayette Escadrille, after the Marquis de Lafayette, a Frenchman who volunteered to help America during her War of Independence.
The men were devoted to the cause, but at the same time, a lot of them were looking for adventure. And let's face it, at that time, if you wanted adventure, the air was a great place to find it.
Airplanes, emerging as effective weapons high above the battlefield, promised pilots fame and honor below. And in a war that was amassing hundreds of thousands of deaths on the ground, To be an aviator was to be above it all, and seemingly invincible.
For most young men who entered aviation during the war, especially if they entered it from the trenches, what they looked up at was clean. The air is clean. I'm down here in this muddy trench. I'm getting blown to bits, shells. My buddies are getting shot around me. I'd like to get out of this.
Those who are watching the industrial slaughter going on in the trenches, part of the horror to them was the idea of simply being ground up in the mud by artillery and perhaps never even being found, let alone remembered. Death in the air, at least, promised that you might be remembered for something.
Just a month after they became the Escadrille, before they had flown their first mission, the budding pilots were already front-page news.
They're under a huge magnifying glass. Things are documented in press about them. Photographs are taken of them. They're unique. So yeah, they do have this special piece of history like the first astronauts. We know of them because of what they did. They're the pioneers in their field.
But notoriety alone wouldn't make them good pilots. Soon the men found themselves strapped into the cockpits of fragile French warplanes, wondering what to do next. Despite their high ambitions and dashing smiles, many had never flown.
The planes themselves were made of wooden canvas, held together by wires. So there wasn't much protection. The only protection you had was getting them before they got you.
But in the Escadrille pilots' minds, the excitement of their new lives far outweighed any risks. One reporter who was sent to cover the Escadrille was so drawn to the camaraderie and character of the men that he decided to join. James Norman Hall. Hall wrote in a letter home that he was intoxicated by what he called the vivid air.
You feel no fear in an airplane after you become used to it, and are perfectly at home, whether you're upside down or standing on your head. I am having the greatest time of my life.
But the days of soaring among the clouds would quickly end as the Escadrille came face to face with their formidable enemy, Germany's top-rated Air Force. The American pilots were determined to prove that they were more than wealthy dilettantes. Kiffin Rockwell, a Baptist minister's son from South Carolina, would be the first to prove it. A born daredevil, Rockwell darted within yards of his target, giving himself a better shot and putting himself in greater danger.
Here's Rockwell, newly trained pilot, sees a German two-seater, dives for that two-seater. He fires 4 rounds. With those 4 rounds, he mortally wounds the observer and the pilot and becomes the first American to down an aircraft.
That night, Rockwell and his comrades celebrated their victory with a rare bottle of bourbon. Giddy with excitement and spiced by the alcohol, the men resolved to toast with the bottle every time they made a kill. From then on, it became known as the Bottle of Death.
I don't think the grim nature of what developed in the air war really hit them until they had been at the front for a while and the combat began to take a toll.
They go out and they drink. They go out and they chase. But you know what? They don't know that they're going to be around tomorrow. And so they're living life to the fullest.
But after 3 months of war, with 5 confirmed kills and no combat losses, the men believed, if not cheating death, they were at least outrunning it. They continued to celebrate their victories with their favorite drink and the 2 camp mascots named after it, lion cubs named Whiskey and Soda.
The men themselves were such individual characters. Their personalities attracted attention, and their exploits attracted attention. it was just a unit that couldn't help but do so. And from the standpoint of the French, who rather wanted the United States to enter, it was a propaganda coup.
With the growing publicity came more volunteers, and the fraternity grew to 38 members, one of whom was Christopher Ford, an orphan from New York City's Lower East Side. Ford grew up with far less pedigree than his comrades, but greater stamina.
My father came from a very, very poor family. In fact, he was orphaned at age 3. He lived on the east side of New York in a tenement, really. He was alone among them who did not have a big education or any financial standing. And because he felt somewhat inferior, he volunteered for extra missions, and he just really went out of his way to prove himself.
As their numbers continued to grow, the new American recruits fanned out to help France's Air Force. Among their new members was Eugene Bullard, son of a slave from Columbus, Georgia. After witnessing his father nearly get lynched, Bullard had come to France to escape racism. When he joined the American Volunteer Force in 1916, Bullard became America's first black aviator.
On the side of his aircraft, he had, in French, the words, "All blood runs red." In other words, everybody's the same. And he's just a man out there doing his job.
The American pilots began flying hundreds of combat sorties every day, convinced that they could fight and win for France. But nothing could prepare them for the Battle of Verdun. Verdun was a fortress city under siege by German forces whose goal wasn't territory, but attrition, killing off more of the enemy than could be replaced. 30,000 lives were lost in just the first days of fighting.
When the Germans decided to attack Verdun, they brought all of their attack aircraft to seize control of the air over Verdun. The French responded immediately by bringing all of their best fighter units to Verdun to beat the Germans back, and the Lafayette Escadrille is part of this aerial effort to gain aerial mastery over Verdun. And it becomes just as bitter a battle in the air as it is on the ground.
Air battles, or dogfights, pitted pilot against pilot in a ruthless death match, often lasting just seconds. The greatest advantage in a dogfight was altitude, flying high with the sun at your back, so when your opponent tried to aim for you, he was blinded by the light. With the intensity of fighting at Verdun came the Escadrille's first combat casualties. Fear dampened their confidence, and a relentless round of fighting pierced their so-called invincibility.
What they begin to realize is those German pilots and observers are very highly trained crews. So if you enter combat with them, you better be very, very careful.
This battle lasts for months. Hundreds of thousands of men are killed on both sides. They start putting aircraft in the air in the morning, in the afternoon, and in the evening. You start seeing these multiple times that a pilot goes out and flies. And the pilots are starting to become fatigued. They're flying for 2.5 hours at any given time. At altitudes of 16,000 feet without oxygen or heat, it's taking its toll on the men. When you look at these guys, they're in their 20s. They look like they're in their 40s. You see the wrinkles, you see the wear, you see the stress.
Kiffin Rockwell, their first star and most popular among his comrades, was haunted by premonitions of death and wrote to a friend that in the event he was shot down, he should be laid to rest exactly where he fell. On September 13, 1916, Rockwell's nightmare came true. He was shot in the chest and quickly lost control of his aircraft, plummeting to the ground and into a field of flowers, just 2 miles from where he had shot down his first enemy aircraft only months earlier.
His loss caused members of the unit to feel as if the soul of the Escadrille had been lost.
Then they realized this is a grim business. It's as grim as being in the trenches.
Humbled by Rockwell's death, when the Escadrille men reluctantly took to the skies, they now just hoped to survive. But for one pilot, survival wasn't enough. Raoul Lufbery wanted revenge. Before joining the American unit, Lufbery had lost his best friend in the war. He came to the Escadrille with an axe ready to grind.
One of his squadron mates once said that the only thing he knew for certain about Lufbery was that Luff lived, fought, and died for revenge.
In just over a year with the unit, Lufbery scored 16 confirmed kills and an estimated 50 total, making him the greatest flying ace the Escadrille had. Meanwhile, Eugene Bullard, who had only 2 victories, vowed never to miss a combat mission. Admired for his bravery, Bullard survived one of the worst air battles when his plane was hit nearly 100 times. By 1917, the volunteers' combat experience had cost them a third of their original members, but the remaining men were among the best pilots in the war. To their fellow citizens back home in America, they were heroes, and fed a growing interest in joining the fight.
When it came to gaining popular sympathy with the American population, their role is incalculable. The interest they generated among Americans in general produced a lot of volunteers for the budding U.S. Army Air Service.
In April of 1917, America declared war on Germany. The Lafayette pilots jumped in to help train the newly arrived recruits for battle. When the American Army formed its own version of an air service, nearly all the Escadrille pilots were invited to join. Eugene Bullard was not. Despite his combat record, Bullard was banned from the American Air Unit and was back facing the racism he thought he had left behind.
The American Air Service said, we have all these standards, and you just don't meet them. They refused to take Bullard in the end because they were not allowing any African Americans in the U.S. Air Service.
Rejected from the pilots' roster, Bullard served out the rest of the war in the French infantry, fighting in the trenches, where he earned France's coveted military honor, the Croix de Guerre. For Christopher Ford, the orphan from New York City, the rest of the war was spent in a German POW camp. Just before Christmas, he was shot down over enemy lines and taken prisoner. While Ford would remain a prisoner for the rest of the war, Raoul Lufbery was promoted to major and taken out of air combat in order to train others. But he refused to stay grounded. One spring morning, as his plane was being repaired, Lufbery spotted a German pilot buzzing overhead. Within seconds, he jumped in a borrowed plane and took off after him. As his comrades watched from below, Lufbery ascended to 2,000 feet and got ready to fire. When the German beat him to the trigger and punctured Lufbery's fuel tank, his cockpit burst into flames and he began a seemingly endless spiral through the air, desperately trying to regain control.
There is some evidence that he may have been trying to maneuver the plane to get to the ground or even put out the flames with a dive. We'll never know. What we do know is that he either jumped or fell out of his plane. In any case, he fell on a picket fence and died in the arms of a peasant woman. By the time the squadron came for him, the local French had covered his body in flowers.
The French town where he was killed came out in masses for the funeral. And Lufberry has this huge funeral, full military honor funeral. Both French and American armies are there.
The Escadrille pilots would fly just another 6 months before the First World War ended with an Allied victory on November the 11th, 1918. The young men who entered the war as wide-eyed volunteers eager for a taste of adventure and lived to tell about it were all grown up. Soon their heroic story faded into myth and memory, and the pilots were all but forgotten. But in 1960, French President Charles de Gaulle made a state visit to the U.S. The one American he most wanted to meet was the man who had risked his life for France, both in the air and in the trenches, Eugene Bullard. A hero in France, Bullard had returned to America an unknown and was now working as an elevator operator at New York City's Rockefeller Center.
Here is Eugene Bullard speaking French, talking with de Gaulle.
De Gaulle kissed him on the cheeks and thanked him for his service for France.
It was something of a shock.
Bullard's meeting with de Gaulle brought to mind once again the men of the Lafayette Escadrille. A year later, Bullard died. His fellow pilots petitioned to have Bullard's name added back into their official roster, where it remains today.
The Lafayette Escadrille were a band of brothers who fought together for a cause they believed in even before their country took it up.
They are the romantic heroes of the First World War. Only the bravest fly in the air, and here's one of our boys doing this.